Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we continue our project voyaging through the works of Lord Dunsany under the assumption that they are the reminiscences of a redcap recorded after retirement. This week's story is The Long Porter's Tale, and the recording is by Ed Humple, released through the LibriVox project into the public domain. The Long Porter's Tale is one of Dunsany's more fantastic works, and so much of the material is directly usable in high fantasy role-playing games. Nonetheless, during the story, I will pop up with inculcations. And now, over to Ed.
There are things that are known only to the Long Porter of Tong Tong Tarrup as he sits and mumbles memories to himself in the little bastion gateway.
These are apparently nonsense words, but we could try to save them. Tong is a Chinese term for a gathering. In media, particularly a criminal enterprise, in European languages, Tong is a descendant of tongue, which means to bite, but has cognates which mean tongue in both the senses of to speak and what is spoken with. Repetition can also be an intensifier. The green grass is greener than the merely green grass. In mythic Europe, this may mean that it is closer to the form. Perfect forms reside in the magic realm, so repetition may be a way to mark that a thing is not just the thing, but of virtue or closer to the form of that thing. Ta in Germanic arguably means tree. In mythic Europe, the tree is a symbol used to metaphorically describe regios that pierce all the way to their aligned realms. The world tree is the axis magica, which is the place where the tides of magic in the world swirl around. It's also used as a metaphor by some shamanistic characters to describe fairy. Up means away, it means up, and it's an intensifier, for example, cheer up. So, arguably, the name refers to the purest language at the top of the tree.
He remembers the war there was in the halls of the gnomes, and how the fairies came for the opals once, which Tong Tong Tarrup has, and the way that the giants went through the fields below, he watching from his gateway. He remembers quests that are even yet a wonder to the gods. Who dwells in those frozen houses on the high bare brink of the world, not even he has told me, and he is held to be garrulous. Among the elves, the only living things ever seen moving at that awful altitude where they quarry turquoise on earth's highest crag, his name is a byword for loquacity wherewith they mock the talkative.
Who are the gnomes, and were they fighting each other or outsiders? Are these the same gnomes which brew a beer that it is damnation to wish to drink, mentioned in a later tale? Those are clearly infernally aligned fairies. Opals are considered a stone of ill luck in period in Ars Magica. As an Australian, I find that odd. Opals are lovely, if so soft that a person making a magic item out of one would be at risk of wrecking the piece. In the real world, opals get their odd colours because they're spheres of silica held together basically by water and luck. Here, and I assume elsewhere, some of the most magnificent opals are fossils. I've seen dinosaur opals, and there's a well-preserved opalized plesiosaur skeleton which would make a wonderful dragon. In setting, opals may contain vitality or imaginum viz. The porter can give quests, and quests which fairies have forgotten. Stories out of him might awaken old roles. The elves quarry turquoise at the top of the world. Some turquoise is sky blue, so it's a question as to if the stones there adopt the colour via contagion from the sky, or if the elves are carving into the crystal sphere that surrounds the earth.
His favourite story, if you offer him bash, the drug of which he is fondest, and for which he will give his service in war to the elves against the goblins, or vice versa if the goblins bring him more. His favourite story, when bodily soothed by the drug and mentally fiercely excited, tells of a quest undertaken ever so long ago, for nothing more marketable than an old woman's song.
Bash is one of Lord Dunsany's made-up words. Strangely, in modern British drug parlance, bash is the stuff used to pad out drugs. The obvious possibility is that bash is another word for bang, which is an anglicisation of a Hindi word for cannabis. Cannabis was considered a lot weirder back in Dunsany's day, and some of his other characters eat hashish to allow spiritual straying and to provide visions. Heading out to war, notably, does not seem to compromise the duties of the porter.
Picture him telling it. An old man, lean and bearded, and almost monstrously long, that lolled in the city's gateway on a crag perhaps 10 miles high. The houses for the most part facing eastward, lit by the sun and moon and the constellations we know, but one house on the pinnacle looking over the edge of the world and lit by the glimmer of those unearthly spaces where one long evening wears away the stars. My little offering of bash, a long forefinger that nipped it at once on a stained and greedy thumb. All these are in the foreground of the picture. In the background, the mystery of those silent houses and of not knowing who their denizens were, or what service they had at the hands of the long porter, and what payment he had in return, and whether he was mortal.
So many hooks. Can his role as porter be taken from him? Is he mortal? A giant? A Nephilim? What does he serve? Whatever they are, live in houses. Is this the hall of heroes in the magic realm?
Picture him in the gateway of this incredible town, having swallowed my bash in silence, stretch his great length, lean back, and begin to speak. It seems that one clear morning 100 years ago, a visitor to Tong Tong Tarrup was climbing up from the world. He had already passed above the snow and had set his foot on a step of the earthward stairway that goes down from Tong Tong Tarrup on to the rocks when the long porter saw him. And so painfully did he climb those easy steps that the grizzled man on watch had long to wonder whether or not the stranger brought him bash, the drug that gives meaning to the stars and seems to explain the twilight.
Does the drug grant enigmatic wisdom? Possibly, because the man is in the deep magical realm, it allows him to mentally stray to Arcadia.
And in the end there was not a scrap of bash, and the stranger had nothing better to offer that grizzled man than his mere story only. It seems that the stranger's name was Gerald Jones, and he always lived in London, but once as a child he had been on a northern moor. It was so long ago that he did not remember how, only somehow or other he walked alone on the moor, and all the ling was in flower. There was nothing in sight but ling and heather and bracken, except, far off near sunset, on indistinct hills, there were little vague patches that looked like the fields of men. With evening a mist crept up and hid the hills, and still he went walking on over the moor. And then he came to the valley, a tiny valley in the midst of the moor, whose sides were incredibly steep. He lay down and looked at it through the roots of the ling. And a long, long way below him, in a garden by a cottage, with hollyhocks all around her that were taller than herself, there sat an old woman on a wooden chair, singing in the evening.
In the language of flowers, hollyhocks represent ambition. Does the staring through the ling have any relevance? The roots of the ling. Is that like staring through a old stone and being able to see fairies?
And the man had taken a fancy to the song, and remembered it after in London, and whenever it came to his mind it made him think of evenings, the kind you don't get in London, and he heard a soft wind going idly over the moor, and the bumblebees in a hurry, and forgot the noise of the traffic. And always, whenever he heard men speak of time, he grudged to time most this song. Once afterwards he went to that northern moor again, and found the tiny valley, but there was no old woman in the garden, and no one was singing a song. And either regret for the song that the old woman had sung, on a summer evening 20 years away and daily receding, troubled his mind, or else the wearisome work that he did in London, for he worked for a great firm that was perfectly useless. And he grew old early, as men do in cities, and at last, when melancholy brought only regret, and the uselessness of his work gained round him with age, he decided to consult a magician. So to a magician he went and told him his troubles, and particularly he told him how he had heard the song. And now, he said, it is nowhere in the world. Of course it is not in the world, the magician said, but over the edge of the world you may easily find it. And he told the man that he was suffering from flux of time, and recommended a day at the edge of the world. Jones asked what part of the edge of the world he should go to, and the magician had heard Tong Tong Tarrup well spoken of. So he paid him, as is usual, in opals, and started at once on the journey.
That magicians are paid in opals seems to argue that they contain viz.
The ways to that town are winding. He took the ticket at Victoria Station that they only give if they know you.
There's a secret society of railway men, perhaps descended from House Mercure, who help you get to magical places if they know you.
He went past Bleth. He went along the hills of Neol Hungar and came to the Gap of Poi. All these are in that part of the world that pertains to the fields we know. But beyond the Gap of Poi, on those ordinary plains that so closely resemble Sussex, one first meets the unlikely. A line of common grey hills, the hills of Sneg, may be seen at the edge of the plain from the Gap of Poi. It is there that the incredible begins, infrequently at first, but happening more and more as you go up the hills. For instance, descending once into Poi Plains, the first thing that I saw was an ordinary shepherd watching a flock of ordinary sheep. I looked at them for some time, and nothing happened, when, without a word, one of the sheep walked up to the shepherd and borrowed his pipe and smoked it. An incident that struck me as unlikely. But, in the hills of Sneg, I met an honest politician. Over these plains went Jones, and over the hills of Sneg, meeting at first unlikely things, and then incredible things, till he came to the long slope beyond the hills that leads up to the edge of the world, and where, as all guidebooks tell, anything may happen. You might at the foot of this slope see here and there things that could conceivably occur in the fields we know, but soon these disappeared, and the traveller saw nothing but fabulous beasts, browsing on flowers as astounding as themselves, and rocks so distorted that their shapes had clearly a meaning, being too startling to be accidental. Even the trees were shockingly unfamiliar, they had so much to say, and they leant over to one another whenever they spoke, and struck grotesque attitudes, and leered. Jones saw two fir trees fighting. The effect of these scenes on his nerves was very severe. Still he climbed on, and was much cheered at last by the sight of a primrose, the only familiar thing he had seen for hours, but it whistled and skipped away. He saw the unicorns in their secret valley. Then night in a sinister way slipped over the sky, and there shone not only the stars, but lesser and greater moons, and he heard dragons rattling in the dark. With dawn there appeared above him among its amazing crags the town of Tong Tong Tarrup, with the light on its frozen stairs, a tiny cluster of houses far up in the sky. He was on the steep mountain now. Great mists were leaving it slowly, and revealing, as they trailed away, more and more astonishing things. Before the mist had all gone he heard quite near him, on what he had thought was a bare mountain, the sound of a heavy galloping on turf. He had come to the plateau of the centaurs. And all at once he saw them in the mist. There they were, the children of Fable, 5 enormous centaurs. Had he paused on account of any astonishment, he had not come so far. He strode on over the plateau, and came quite near to the centaurs. It is never the centaurs' wont to notice men. They pawed the ground and shouted to one another in Greek, but they said no word to him. Nevertheless they turned and stared at him when he left them, and when he had crossed the plateau and still went on, all 5 of them cantered after to the edge of their green land, for above the high green plateau of the centaurs is nothing but naked mountains, and the last green thing that is seen by the mountaineer as he travels to Tong Tong Tarrup is the grass that the centaurs trample. He came into the snowfields that the mountain wears like a cape, its head being bare above it, and still climbed on. The centaurs watched him with increasing wonder. Not even fabulous beasts were near him now, nor strange demoniac trees, nothing but snow and the clean bare crag above it, on which was Tong Tong Tarrup. All day he climbed, and evening found him above the snow line, and soon he came to the stairway cut in the rock and in sight of that grizzled man, the long porter of Tong Tong Tarrup, sitting mumbling amazing memories to himself, and expecting in vain from the stranger a gift of bash. It seems that as soon as the stranger arrived at the bastion gateway, tired though he was, he demanded lodgings at once that commanded a good view of the edge of the world. But the long porter, that grizzled man, disappointed of his bash, demanded the stranger's story to add to his memories before he would show him the way. And this is the story, if the long porter has told me the truth, and if his memory is still what it was. And when the story was told, the grizzled man arose, and, dangling his musical keys, went up through door after door and by many stairs, and led the stranger to the topmost house, the highest roof in the world, and in its parlour showed him the parlour window. There the tired stranger sat down in a chair, and gazed out of the window sheer over the edge of the world. The window was shut, and in its glittering panes the twilight of the world's edge blazed and danced, partly like glowworms' lamps and partly like the sea. It went by rippling, full of wonderful moons. But the traveller did not look at the wonderful moons. For from the abyss there grew with their roots in far constellations a row of hollyhocks, and amongst them a small green garden quivered and trembled as scenes tremble in water. Higher up, ling in bloom was floating upon the twilight, more and more floated up till all the twilight was purple. The little green garden low down was hung in the midst of it, and the garden down below, and the ling all around it, seemed all to be trembling and drifting on a song. For the twilight was full of a song that sang and rang along the edges of the world, and the green garden and the ling seemed to flicker and ripple with it as the song rose and fell, and an old woman was singing it down in the garden. A bumblebee sailed across from over the edge of the world. And the song that was lapping there against the coasts of the world, and to which the stars were dancing, was the same he had heard the old woman sing long since down in the valley in the midst of the northern moor.
Is this the music of the spheres, the sound made by the interaction of the fundamental principles of the universe? I think this may be what magi see when they learn from Viz, the fundamental forces of the universe made manifest and visible. Who is the woman who knows the song? I wonder if the Magnificat and this music of the spheres are related. The Magnificat is the song of Mary at the Visitation. If not, was this woman having a twilight experience? Could some Creaman magi, as they leave the world, provide a sort of commentary which their sodales observe to study magic theory or vim, a death poem or a swan song? Do their tattoos go infest others as their wisdom is replicated?
But that grizzled man, the long porter, would not let the stranger stay, because he brought him no bash, and impatiently he shouldered him away, himself not troubling to glance through the world's outermost window. For the lands that time afflicts, and the spaces that time knows not, are all one to that grizzled man, and the bash that he eats more profoundly astounds his mind than anything man can show him, either in the world we know or over the edge. And bitterly protesting, the traveller went back and down again to the world. Accustomed as I am to the incredible, from knowing the edge of the world, the story presents difficulties to me. Yet it may be that the devastation wrought by time is merely local, and that outside the scope of his destruction old songs are still being sung by those that we deem dead. I try to hope so. And yet the more I investigate the story that the long porter told me in the town of Tong Tong Tarap, the more plausible the alternative theory appears, that grizzled man is a liar.
And thanks again to Ed and all the LibriVox volunteers. See you next week.